A lot of people might ask, hey Comfy, why are we talking about line weight in the boxes section? There was a whole section about lines. What gives? If you find yourself wondering the same thing, that's fair, but I promise, there's a good reason for this, and it comes down to how we primarily use line weight in this course. At its core, line weight refers to the difference in thickness between different lines. A thinner line is described as having less weight than a thicker line, and this influences the way in which we process the visual information those lines describe. It also has an impact on composition, on how our eyes consume an image, and in what order we look at the different aspects of it. There's a great deal one can convey with lines, but what we're going to focus on here relates to one concept: overlaps in 3D space. That's why we're exploring this here, in the boxes section. Prior to this, we were only looking at marks on a flat page, and it's only recently that we've explored the idea of depth in the scene. Looking at this drawing, we've got a square and a circle. Though these are flat, two-dimensional shapes, they can still be arranged in 3 dimensions, meaning one of these being closer to the viewer and the other being farther. This can be conveyed by simply having one block or occlude the other, but as you'll find throughout this course, we frequently draw everything in its entirety, even where it might be blocked from sight, because it helps us better understand how those forms sit in 3D space and how they relate to one another within it, given that it's the whole focus of this course. So, if we can't make use of occlusion to tell the viewer which object is in front of the other, we have to rely on other tools. One such tool is, as you might have guessed, line weight. When different lines intersect, there are a variety of ways in which the eye can interpret how they are intended to flow as they create the silhouette of a single form. So if we look at our square-circle example, while there are enough visual cues here for us to understand the distinction between the two shapes, someone who has never seen a square or a circle in their lives could ostensibly interpret the two shapes very differently, as we see here. Another way to think about this is to view each line as a road, and all those lines being equal, wherever they meet, we get an intersection that allows cars to move from one to another as they wish. This is not what we want. If the viewer's eyes can move around and interpret the shapes and forms we're constructing in a variety of ways, that could certainly be interesting for a fine art piece. But for the purposes of visual communication, we want to be able to control how the viewer processes what we've drawn. So, instead of creating 4-way intersections wherever the lines meet, we instead want to create the impression that these roads pass over or below one another, so that while they do cross, traffic is still restricted to flowing in a very specific fashion. For city planners, they might employ an overpass to lift one road over the other. Here, by giving one line a thicker weight where they cross, the viewer is less inclined to go off-route, but will instead have more reason to stick with the line they're already following. This does not mean that we have to make the entirety of one line thicker. So for example, if we wanted to make the square read as though it were in front of the circle, we would not need to make the entire square uniformly thick. Instead, we can increase the thickness of our stroke as it approaches the intersection, making it gradually get thicker and then thin out again. This can be tricky to do, but it gets easier with practice, especially as you get used to employing the ghosting method and the confident execution it insists upon. It does help, however, that we're not adding it to the whole thing, but rather a shorter section. Just be sure not to execute it from your wrist, which is more likely to cause you to go off track, and despite whatever fears you may have over making a mistake and ruining your drawing, always execute the stroke confidently. While we can't really use the start and end points from the ghosting method's planning phase here, since it would counteract the line weight itself, we can still go through the same steps to identify the nature of the mark we wish to make, rotate the page for a comfortable angle of approach, get familiar with the motion required to make it, And finally, execute with confidence. This is more or less the same as how you'd be employing the ghosting method for any marks that don't have concrete start and end points like ellipses. I get it, mistakes suck, but they have no bearing on what we actually learn from these exercises. The end result being perfect does not help you learn better or faster. But in focusing on that, you're more likely to slow down your execution, to make your marks more hesitantly, and to ultimately get a lot less out of it. And there you have it, how to employ line weight for your Drawabox homework.